So for Wednesday, I'm just reading the first half of A Small Place, right? So just up to page 37. So let's just quickly go over the vocab from last time. And a lot of what we're going to be talking about today is going to relate back to a lot of this stuff. So I just want to make sure that there were some answers you gave me on the quiz this weekend that weren't technically incorrect, but didn't really relate back to what we'd spoken about, or or to the novel, right? So let's just see how quick we can get through this, and we'll get on to finishing this up. So Jamila Singer.
She's a part of the Midnight Children, isn't she?
She is not.
She is, what's her name? Brass Monkey.
Yeah, Jamila is the Brass Monkey's actual name, right? So she's Salim's sister, who becomes a superstar in Pakistan, right? While singing underneath, or singing behind a perforated sheet.
Mm-hmm.
And then when the whole family is destroyed, she goes into hiding in a Christian convent. And Salim's unspeakable love, right, is for his sister.
Yeah.
Even though she's not really actually biologically his sister, which is part of how he justifies it, right?
Mm-hmm.
All right. The real purpose of the 1965 Indo-Pakistani War. I put real in quotation marks here for a reason, right? It's what Salim thinks is the real purpose of the 1965 war. Why does he think this war was fought?
From my notes, it said the conflict of orders outpath.
Yeah, it was like the ostensible cause, right? Remember, there are two layers of narrative here, right? There's the official historical narrative, and there's Salim's underground narrative. And so what I'm asking about here is what it is in Salim's underground narrative, right? So it's a border dispute in the official narrative, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in Salim's personal narrative, the real purpose of the war was to destroy his family, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because virtually every member of his family, with the exception of himself, Jamila, and his uncle Mustafa, who's the only family member who still lives in India, right? They're all killed.
Mm-hmm.
So this is kind of illustrating that two-pronged nature of the narrative, right? That Salim's story is pushing up against what the official historical narrative is, kind of writing counter to it. And I think you got Mustafa Aziz confused with his father.
I think so.
Right, Adam Aziz is the doctor
Mm-hmm.
from the beginning of the novel. Mustafa Aziz is his son,
Mm-hmm.
right, the family mediocrity, who is an Indian civil servant,
Mm-hmm.
who's been number 2 in his department for ages, partly because he's a terrible sycophant,
Mm-hmm.
and partly because his wife can't help insulting whoever's the number 3 wife beneath her.
Mm-hmm.
And then when that number 3 inevitably gets promoted to number 1, the relationship's already poisoned, right?
Mm-hmm.
But Mustafa also kind of embodies that kind of double level of consciousness here, right? Where on the one hand, like, he's sycophantically loyal to whoever happens to be in government at the time,
Mm-hmm.
but he also is firmly convinced that the reason he can't move any higher is because of anti-Muslim prejudice in the government, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he's holding these two contradictory ideas in his head simultaneously. All right, the magicians of Delhi. Tell me about these magicians.
From my notes, Salim hangs out around with the street magicians.
Mm-hmm.
They're materialistic, they create illusion for people, and they don't believe in the false narrative and stuff like that.
That they don't believe in any kind of magic, right? So that's what I mean by It's materialist, not materialistic, right? So materialistic would suggest they're greedy, or they care about, gathering up material things. Materialist means that they don't believe in anything beyond objective, observable reality, right? Because they're illusionists. So they know the tricks, right? They know how they're done. But there is one member of their group who does possess real magic, right? So tell me a little bit about Parvati the witch.
She put Salman under a spell and stuff. She's one of them, and she basically put him under a spell to make him believe something different than what he believed, I guess.
Not quite. So she lives with the magicians and has grown up among them. But she is also one of those original Midnight's children. And the thing that makes her different from the other magicians is that she is actually able to use sorcery, right? Like her magic is real. And she does put Salim under a spell, but it's not like a charm kind of spell, right? She stores him in her basket when he is trying to get out of East Pakistan, and brings him to India. So the basket is almost like a kind of like a secondary womb. And then she is in love with Salim, but Salim won't marry her because every time he sees her, every time he sees her face, he sees his sister's face kind of rotting away.
I thought it was because he kept seeing Auburn.
And so she goes and conceives a child. She puts Shiva under a spell and conceives a child with him, which Salim then raises as his son, Adam, right? And Parvati, right, the name is also important, right? Parvati is an important Hindu goddess. So one of the things that I want to discuss today is the way a Hindu principle called Shakti, or kind of like goddess power, is really prevalent, especially at the end of the narrative. And Salim talks about, his vulnerability to women, and his grandfather's vulnerability to women, and even his father's vulnerability to chasing his secretaries around and pinching their asses and things, right? So
that's sexual assault.
So why none of the secretaries last very long? But yeah, so let's stick a pin in this. We're going to come back to it. I think you also got the Nawab of Keef slightly confused with his son, Mudasim the Handsome.
Yeah.
So who's the Nawab of Keef?
I know we talked about it, he falls in love with Jamila, Brass Monkey, and
The Nawab does not. His son, Mudasim, falls in love with Jamila. And has that spell that he gives to Salim, right? So the Nawab of Keef he's a Pakistani aristocrat, right? He engages one of his daughters to marry Zafar Zulfikar. But what's important about him is that he advocates modernization and progress, but in a really undemocratic kind of way, right? He takes those guys from the opposition party and locks them up in his palace on election day so they can't go vote. And he also he's also when the villagers in Keef won't get out of the way of his car, he just runs them over. Essentially kind of stampeding over them with progress, right? And Zulfikar, who is Zafar?
That's the son. is that he kept scaring and he repeated himself a lot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's Salim's first cousin,
Mm-hmm.
the son of his Aunt Emerald and of General Zulfikar. And yeah, Zafar is the one who can't hold his bladder, right? He's constantly pissing his pants. And he murders his father after just kind of one humiliation too many, right? When he finds out that his father is the one who is actually responsible for all of these abandoned border posts that are being used by, not by Indian troops, but by smugglers that have paid his father off.
He did it. His father deserved it.
Yeah, no, General Zulfikar is,
Nasty.
yeah, from his first appearance near the beginning of the novel is a pretty serious turd, right? All right, the All India Congress, or the Indian National Congress, is the main political party, or the most popular political party in the first several decades of India's existence as an independent nation, right?
Mm-hmm.
So this is the party, right, basically, right, center-left politically, secular, and has long been run by what's called the Nehru-Gandhi dynasty, right? So Jawaharlal Nehru, the first Prime Minister of India, and then his daughter Indira Gandhi. And now her grandson, Rahul Gandhi, is the leader of the party. But we'll talk more about this particular family today because they're real important to what's going on at the end of the novel. All right, now we already talked a little bit about these abandoned border posts in the Ran of Kutch, right? These are where Zafar learns what has really been happening and that his father is deeply involved. Right, they're the point of dispute in this war, but yeah, they're abandoned because high-ranking officials are being paid off to abandon them, so smugglers can use them. Okay, and finally, like, you gave me a definition of progress, but not what progress represents or how it's treated in this novel, right? So how does Rushdie tend to treat the idea of progress? Think about the Nawab of Keef and his car.
I said, notice he said progress plus future equals machines.
Yeah.
So advancement of like technology and stuff like that.
Yeah, so technological advancement is a big part of it, right? But the missing part there is that it's technological advancement or economic modernization against the wishes or over the heads of the people, right? So it's something that tends to be imposed by leaders on people who don't understand it or don't want it. And that's actually kind of what's going to bring us to the crisis at the end of the novel, right? So by and large, the end of the novel is taking place in a period of Indian history that is referred to as the emergency. So this is a lengthy period between 1975 and 1977, in which Indira Gandhi ran India as basically without any kind of opposition, right? So just to quickly explain here what happened. So Indira Gandhi convinces she's the prime minister, so she convinces the president to temporarily suspend the Constitution. And this is arguably triggered by the fact that several high-ranking members of her government were brought up on corruption charges. And she was trying to stop having her government dissolved as a result. One of the guys, for example, is actually killed. Rushdie refers to him in the novel as the Minister for Railroads and Bribery. So we can see that Rushdie's attitude towards Indira Gandhi and towards the emergency period is not a positive one, right? He does not think much of Mrs. Gandhi. So during this period, the Indian Constitution is suspended. And Indira Gandhi is given the power officially by the government to rule by decree. Now, think about like how in a parliamentary system government typically works, right? What do you have to do, even in our system, which is not parliamentary, right? What do you have to do to get a bill passed?
You gotta run it by legislators and stuff like that.
Yeah. And what happens if you don't have the votes?
Just don't get passed.
It doesn't happen. Yeah, right, exactly. You have to have the votes in order to get anything passed. And in a parliamentary system, right, you have to maintain unity within your coalition in order not just to get things passed, but also to keep the government from dissolving, right? So if the prime minister is just given the power to rule by decree, what happens to that whole process? Does the legislature even serve any purpose? Not really, right? Yeah.
It's like the power's already given to you, then the legislature didn't really want anything.
Yeah, right. They can protest, right? But there's not really very much they can do about it. So civil liberties were also suspended during this period, and Gandhi's government uses the opportunity to push through a lot of controversial initiatives. Among them, things like slum clearances, right? Essentially, like, going in and bulldozing slum neighborhoods and forcibly relocating people. And even kind of in a more sinister way, her younger son, Sanjay, leads a pro-vasectomy campaign.
What is a pro-vasectomy?
Vasectomy? What is a vasectomy?
Is that like, I think I know what a vasectomy is. I just thought about it like, so like pro-life type. That's what they have.
Yeah, so a vasectomy is essentially, it's when it's a surgery that a man has to prevent having children, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't actually typically remove anything, it just cuts connections between things.
And so that's what that campaign is about.
Yeah, he's encouraging men to have vasectomies, right? So that, so that families have fewer children. But the darker whisperings that Rushdie is picking up on and amplifying here are that underneath this pro-vasectomy campaign was actually a campaign of forced sterilization of the poor. Right, actually like rounding up poor people putting them in putting them in ambulance vans and giving them vasectomies or hysterectomies without their consent.
That sounds terrible.
Mm-hmm. It kind of is. And so this is the kind of abuse of power, right?
Mm-hmm.
That Rushdie seems particularly keen to push back against in this novel. This is the kind of thing where he says, like, okay, this is a thing that the official narrative ignores, right? Or tends to kind of glide over. And it's a story that needs to be told. So I just kind of want to, as a reminder here, that we're dealing with real people and real historical events. I want to show you some of these people and how Rushdie uses their physical descriptions in the narrative to make particular points about them. So this is Indira Gandhi, right? And did you notice anything that Rushdie said about, like, he rarely calls her Indira Gandhi.
Mm-hmm.
He usually refers to her as the widow.
She kind of has the look of the world.
What's that?
She kind of has the look of the world.
Well, what aspect of her appearance did you notice Rushdie using in the narrative? Do you notice anything about her hair?
It's gray in some areas.
Yeah, he mentions like that, she's got center parted hair, half white, half black, right? And he uses this like kind of to talk about there being a kind of white official historical narrative, and also the black undercurrent, the underground history nobody talks about. So just like William Methwold had that center parting in his wig that covered up the fact that he was bald, Indira Gandhi also has center parted hair, and the two colors represent the two sides of the narrative, right? The official and the underground history.
She has center hair too.
What's that?
She has center hair too.
She also has center parted hair. That is Maneka Gandhi, and her husband Sanjay. And Sanjay is described in the narrative, like, mostly, like, he comes to dinner at Uncle Mustafa's once, and drops some hints about what his mother wants to do about the Midnight's Children. But yeah, so we see all these people who look like Sanjay popping up around the ghettos, right? This youth movement. He was the leader of the Congress Party's youth movement while he was alive. He actually died very young, I think in a plane crash. There are these young men who are described as having labia-like lips and curly black hair. So yeah, there are these kind of mini Sanjays popping up all over the place, trying to clear people out of slums and give them vasectomies. And Maneka actually remains active in politics after her husband's death. She's a former fashion model, but she becomes a leading figure in far-right politics in India. She joins one of the leading Hindu nationalist parties and becomes really prominent with them. And this is...
Her hair's not center.
What's that?
Her hair doesn't look center.
Well, it doesn't need to. This is... How the hell do I spell this? Ruxana Sultan. And the sunglasses are the key feature here. She's the one, she was a kind of a wealthy socialite who was deeply involved in the Congress Party and closely associated with Indira and Sanjay Gandhi. And she's the one who is described as the widow's hand. In the novel. The one who's kind of like overseeing the forced sterilization of all of the Midnight's children.
So second-hand commander?
Yeah, I mean, she didn't have any official government position, but she was rich, she was attractive, and she was very well connected with the upper levels of the Congress Party. And the last historical figure that I just want to make sure we bring in here, because he's been mentioned actually for a long time here, is this guy, Morarji Desai. So Morarji Desai is a member of Jawaharlal Nehru's government in the 40s. Like, so he's a member of one of those first post-independent governments. I think he was the finance minister. And had a long history with the party. Now remember, the part of the narrative here, right, is of like India cracking up into pieces, right, and Salim believing himself to be cracking up into pieces. Well, one of those first crack-ups happens in the late 60s when, after Jawaharlal Nehru's death, the Congress Party actually splits into two factions, right? There's Indira Gandhi's faction, and another faction that is led by Morarji Desai and some of the other kind of like first generation of Indian political leaders. Indira's faction is bigger and becomes dominant. But Desai and another Congress veteran politician by the name of J.P. Narayan in the 70s, managed to unite most of the main opposition parties because they figured the only way to actually unseat Indira Gandhi or the Congress Party is to get everybody else together into this kind of Big Tent party. Now, what usually happens to these kind of Big Tent political parties that contain a lot of people who don't agree with each other? What's that?
They get killed off?
Well, do they get killed off literally?
No, they get shipped off to stuff and go into a forbidden land or something.
Yeah, well, I mean, they typically have a hard time holding together and getting anything done, right? Because their only common ground is that they're in opposition to someone else. So like we just had an example not too long ago, there was a really short-lived Israeli government, right? All these parties that really don't like each other went into coalition with each other in order to try to prevent Benjamin Netanyahu from becoming prime minister again. And then ultimately, their coalition fell apart because these parties didn't like each other and didn't agree with each other about anything, except that they hated Netanyahu more than they hated each other, right? That's kind of what the party Narayan and Desai form is like. It's called the Janata Party, and they rule for a short time in the late 70s. In fact, they would have been the party in charge at the time Rushdie is writing this novel. And I think this is a thing that we need to keep in mind, is that these people that Rushdie is writing, in many ways some pretty negative things about, are all still alive at the time that he's writing this novel, right? Indira Gandhi dies in 1984. The novel's published in 1980. Yeah, pretty much all of these people are still alive at least into the mid-80s. But the other thing about Desai here, right, and Narayan, is that while they're presented as an alternative to Indira Gandhi, right, they're also described as, having, as, old men with papery skin, right? And Desai, poor bastard. Okay, so while he was prime minister, Desai gave an interview with the American news program 60 Minutes, in which he talked about a certain traditional medicinal practice that he particularly endorsed, right? He drank a glass of urine every day, which, this was, like, the science says don't do this, right? There's no benefit from it. But in a lot of cultures, this is like a part of homeopathic medicine, right? That, somehow drinking your own pee promotes good general health. And I mean, Desai lived to be pretty old. So, but nonetheless, right, like the phrase that Rushdie typically uses to describe Morarji Desai is urine-drinking dotard, right? Confused old man who drinks pee. So what we're being presented with here at the end of the novel, right, is this choice between a dynasty, right, this family dynasty that doesn't seem to care much about individual rights or democracy, or this kind of frozen in amber first generation government, right? There's nothing new coming down the pike here. So both alternatives to Rushdie kind of look like bad ones, right? Either we're frozen in the late 40s forever, or we have the Nehru-Gandhi family running things and having everything their own way. And this is where this whole, I think, this widow narrative becomes interesting, right? So he calls her the widow partly because she is. Her husband died in what is often regarded as a suspicious train accident in the 1960s. But remember that the whole purpose here of Salim's narrative is to provide an alternative to the official history, right? Now, what the widow does in sterilizing all of the Midnight's children is essentially shut down the possibility of an alternative, right? So what he's accusing her of doing is closing off any kind of alternative vision for the country, right? You could have this you could have the progress that Indira promotes, right? The version of progress that she promotes from up above, which includes things like sterilization campaigns, but also did, to her credit, include very successful anti-poverty campaigns. Right? A lot was done while she was prime minister to reduce suffering among the Indian poor, which is why, like, despite the emergency and despite the issue, the accusations of corruption that dogged her administration, she's still remembered fondly by a lot of people in India. So, again, like Rushdie's version of Indira is not the only Indira that there is. But he's also kind of writing safely from exile in Britain while she's in power. He also happens to be writing this while she's out of power, and this probably has less power behind him. But yeah, essentially what he's accusing her of doing is kind of shutting down this generation of magical children who are like all of these possibilities, right? You know, these 500 some different unique possibilities that emerge out of that first hour of independence. And when Indira's done, right, there's only one, there's only her, right? This is it. She'll brook no rivals, and Rushdie's telling, to her national dominance. And so what we're getting from here, this is, the black hair side of things, right? Is also kind of, I think, like the darker side of this idea of, right, Shakti or goddess power. Is that even though, like, Rushdie is a Muslim, but having grown up in India, he's also pretty familiar with a lot of Hindu theological and cultural concepts. And so Shakti is the feminine form of cosmic energy, and is usually represented as a goddess married to the god Shiva. And we may recall from previous conversations, right? What is Shiva the god of?
I cannot remember from the top of my head. I know we talked about it in class. I just cannot remember from it.
Okay. So Shiva is the god of procreation and destruction.
Yeah.
So on the whole, we're looking at like a god of
I spelled
progress and change in a lot of ways. And his namesake in the novel, right, is on the one hand, like, he's a killer, right, who goes around crushing people's windpipes with his massive knees, but is also an extremely prolific fatherer of children.
How's that balance?
What's that?
Yeah, how's that? He kills people with his knees, but then
Yeah.
he's still a good father.
Well, no, he's not a good father.
But he's
right?
a father.
He's a prolific father. Right? He goes out and impregnates a lot of women, right? And then immediately abandons them once he learns they're pregnant.
Sounds like a father.
And because he's a war hero, he is exempt from the widow's sterilization program. She doesn't subject him to the same strictures as the others. But ironically then, all of these children are being born like Salim's adopted son Adam, right? Who are themselves, they are the children of the Midnight's children. Right? Hell, Adam is the child of two Midnight's children, Shiva and Parvati, then raised by Salim.
Has he got a bed by himself?
Yeah.
That's not bad. Also, he's in a little realistic on that.
Well, remember, like in the realism part of magical realism is, it's basically something for the magic to push against, right?
Yeah.
The magical part is really kind of like the most important, like the kind of challenging of these Western rationalist narratives. So there are three goddesses with kind of different characteristics and aspects who are all kind of one being in Shakti, right?
Mhm.
And they're all typically depicted as the wives of Shiva.
Cool, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, so this is Durga. And Durga is the face of Shakti that's associated with protection, especially from demons.
See the
with
guy, he looks like demon.
Yeah,
And then the tigers like attack it, they back
it's
end
a
of them.
water buffalo. Yeah,
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 because
yeah,
his head's
it's-
there.
and then this is yes, some kind of that's, I forget what the precise myth is here. It's some kind of water buffalo demon that she is engaged in battle against. Yeah, but yeah, she's associated with war, protection, and motherhood. And the wet nurse that Adam is given to, with the constantly flowing breasts, is a washerwoman named Durga. And this is Parvati, who is usually like kind of regarded as the gentle face of Shakti. So Parvati is associated with love, beauty, and devotion.
Yeah. I thought it was a little bit, yeah, devotion.
And it's probably the here, like, because we've got Shiva and Parvati in the novel, right? She's here depicted with her husband Shiva. And they're just kind of like beaming at each other and smiling into each other's eyes, right? And the most fearsome of Shakti's manifestations is Kali. And Kali is associated with time, destruction, and change. So, like, all of these, like this necklace of severed heads that she wears is, it looks gruesome, right? But what it's supposed to represent is victory over time and over fear of death. And here she's, her husband Shiva has, laid down underneath her as she's like on the rampage to try to calm her fury.
I thought he was dead.
Yeah, he's a god.
Gods and still gods. They're immortal, but there's a weakness to gods.
Well, at any rate, what he's doing here is trying to soften her rage, right? So that's the idea here. But this is the image, particularly with the bloody knife, and the images of like. So the widow isn't cutting off people's heads, but she is cutting off people. Like, she is not just giving vasectomies to the Midnight's children, right? She's giving hysterectomies and testectomies, right? She's removing wombs and removing testicles, because a vasectomy can be undone.
Yeah.
Yeah, a testectomy, no. There's no coming back from that, right? And what Salman calls what she's doing, he gives it a special name. He calls it sperectomy. Right, so ectomy, in Greek means removal. Spare, S-P-E-R, means hope. And so metaphorically, what we have going on here is this sterilization campaign, essentially against anything too fanciful, right? I think what he is accusing Indira Gandhi of doing is imposing a Western rational idea of progress onto an India that he regarded, the strength of which he regards as its incredible diversity of ways of belief, of ways of speaking, of ways of being, right? And that this, to him, I think, is a betrayal of the vision of what the nation could have been. Mm-hmm. You know, it could have been, freakishly beautiful beggar girls and children who can fly and who can walk through mirrors, and werewolves and, boy telepaths and things like that. You know, there could have been all of these myriad possibilities that the all-consuming personality of the widow just shuts down, right? Even the opposition party of Narayan and Desai is defined not by its own ideology, but by its opposition to Indira Gandhi. So, the slogan that Indira's supporters frequently used during and after the emergency, in fact, was India is Indira, and Indira is India. She's unseated by the Janata Coalition in 1977, and they managed to hang on for a couple of years until 1980, at which point she's reelected. And then in 1984, she's assassinated by members of her bodyguard in retaliation for perceived crimes perpetrated against the Sikh community in the region called the Punjab. So, what I want to take a quick look at here now is the very end of the novel, right? We're going to take a look at these last 2 pages as Salim contemplates marriage to Padma, who wants to then honeymoon with him in Kashmir. Another kind of interesting side note here, right? So Salim's family are Kashmiris, right? The Nehru Gandhis also have Kashmiri roots. Right, that's where their family origins are. So page 532. Right. No, that won't do. I shall have to write the future as I have written the past, to set it down with the absolute certainty of a prophet. But the future cannot be preserved in a jar. One jar must remain empty. What cannot be pickled because it has not taken place is that I shall reach my birthday, 31 today, and no doubt a marriage will take place, and Padma will have henna tracery on her palms and soles, and also a new name, perhaps Nasim in honor of Reverend Mother's watching ghost, and outside the window there will be fireworks and crowds, because it will be Independence Day and the many-headed multitudes will be in the streets, and Kashmir will be waiting. I will have train tickets in my pocket. There will be a taxi cab driven by a country boy who once dreamed at the Pioneer Cafe of film stardom. We will drive south, south, south into the heart of the tumultuous crowds, who will be throwing balloons of paint at one another. At the wound-up windows of the cab, as if it were the day of the paint festival of Holi. And along Hornby Villard, where a dog was left to die, the crowd, the dense crowd, the crowd without boundaries, growing until it fills the world, will make progress impossible. We will abandon our taxi cab and the dreams of its driver, on our feet in the thronging crowd, and yes, I will be separated from Padma, my dumb lotus extending an arm towards me across the turbulent sea, until she drowns in the crowd and I am alone in the vastness of the numbers, The numbers marching 1, 2, 3. I am being buffeted right and left while Rip, Tear, Crunch reaches its climax, and my body is screaming. It cannot take this kind of treatment anymore. But now I see familiar faces in the crowd. They are all here. My grandfather Adam and his wife Nassim, and Aliyah and Mustafa and Hanif and Emerald, and Amina who was Mumtaz, and Nadir who became Qasim, and Pia and Zafar who wet his bed, and also General Zulfikar. They throng around me, pushing, shoving, crushing, and the cracks are widening. Pieces of my body are falling off. There is Jamila, who has left her memory to be present on this last day. Night is falling, has fallen. There is a countdown tick-tocking to midnight, fireworks and stars, the cardboard cutouts of wrestlers, and I see that I shall never reach Kashmir. Like Jahangir of the Mughal Empire, I shall die with Kashmir on my lips, unable to see the valley of delights to which men go to enjoy life, or to end it, or both. Because now I see other figures in the crowd, the terrifying figure of a war hero with lethal knees, who has found out how I cheated him of his birthright. He is pushing towards me through the crowd, which is now wholly composed of familiar faces. There is Rashid, the rickshaw boy, arm in arm with the Rani of Kuch Nahin, and Ayuba Shahid Farouk with Mutasim the Handsome. And from another direction, the direction of Haji Ali's island tomb, I see a mythological apparition approaching, the Black Angel. Except that as it nears me, its face is green, its eyes are black, a center parting in its hair, on the left the green and on the right black, its eyes the eyes of widows. Shiva and the angel are closing. I hear lies being spoken in the night. Anything you want to be, you can be, the greatest lie of all. Cracking now, fission of Salim. I am the bomb in Bombay, watch me explode. Bones splitting, breaking beneath the awful pressure of the crowd. Bag of bones falling down, down, down. Just as it once at Jallianwala, but Dyer seems not to be present today. No mercurochrome, only a broken creature spilling pieces of itself into the street. Because I have been so many too many persons. Life, unlike syntax, allows one more than three. And at last somewhere, the striking of a clock, 12 chimes, release. So one, this is almost all a single sentence, right?
I
Yeah.
remember reading them.
Yeah, it's just this giant block of text, right? But this is how Salim envisions his final cracking apart, right? So what happens to him is along the lines of what we often see in apocalyptic narrative, right? So what do we usually think of when we see the word apocalypse?
Zombies.
What's that?
Zombies.
Okay, so you think of a zombie apocalypse, right?
The end of the world.
Yeah, the end of the world, right?
Mhm.
But what the word apocalypse actually means is revelation, which is one of the last book of the Christian Bible. The Apocalypse of St. John is also called the Revelation of St. John, right?
Mhm.
So because it describes a vision of the end of the world, we've come to associate the word apocalypse with the end of the world, right? But then, at the end of an apocalypse, right, there's usually something new coming out of it, right? The old world breaks apart and changes so that something new can be born.
Zombies.
Pardon?
I still say zombies as well.
So even as Shiva and the widow, right? Shiva and the darker version of Shakti, which now seems to be kind of more directly related to the goddess Kali, right? Are coming for Salim. It's probably worth noting that in Hinduism, right, Shiva and Kali they're not evil gods. the destruction that they bring is intended to clear the way for new life and for a new world. And I think that where the novel is going here is kind of towards an idea that whether it was her intention or not, what Indira Gandhi has done is actually kind of cleared the ground, cleared the way for something new that will oppose her to rise up. It is cold in here, yeah. I should also note that Mrs. Gandhi was very vocal in her distaste for this novel. Yeah.
It had, like, I was confused the first time, I got it in the second half, third half, still confused, like, this whole book is like, oh yeah, I get it, and I don't get it.
Well, I think, like, really, I think the main thing to get from this is that idea that the official narrative always conceals other possible narratives, right? That certain powerful people may want it to appear that there is only one story, right? But underneath that one story, or surrounding that one story, there are 1,001 others, right?
Yeah, unreliable.
Yeah, well, I mean, not even necessarily the unreliable narrator concept here, right? Just that there are alternative narratives. And a real kind of like resistance to any kind of unitary authority. And that's, I think, kind of like what the magical realist novel really pushes back against, is the idea that any one type of narrative has a monopoly on truth. All right, so I'm going to give you the reading questions for the Kincaid piece, and we'll stop there.
I already started reading it a little, like 2 or 3 pages of it.
Uh-huh.
During my presentation, because I knew I was going to use it.
Yeah, well, read more of it, because you're going to do a presentation on it.
I'm reading it tonight. I don't have all my sources, sadly.
Okay.
I have the history of modern tourists that just came and got shipped in Albany. So I'm like, I gotta go pick it up. I don't know what the library is. So that's the biggest problem. And I think I have the class.